Hi BookTube, I'm here today with my November wrap-up. Yeah, I got the tree up already. Reggie is sitting in the comfy chair, so I'm stuck in the other not as comfy but still comfy chair. And we're just gonna jump right into it. These are in no particular order. So, Bamboo and Friends by John Atkinson. This was a reread for me. This was one of my childhood favorites. I did a video about that, and I'll link it down below. So this was a childhood favorite. I actually met the author and he signed the book for me. I think I was like 7 or 8. I vaguely remember him signing the book. And this book is all about being kind and a fotu, which means friend of the universe. So in the story, Bamboo is an alien that comes down to Earth and he meets this other little boy, and then another friend comes down from space and her name is Windshield Wiper. Doesn't explain why it's such an odd name, but there we go. And they find out that the zookeeper, like the owner of the zoo, is skimming money off of the animals' food budget for himself, and so the animals are going hungry. So they decide that they're going to break all the animals out of the zoo, and things happen from there. It is definitely a children's chapter book. I would say it's not really middle grade. Like, it's very, very, very easy to read, very straightforward. And reading this, looking back and looking at it, was probably like 7 or 8. Reading this, it's no wonder I am an anti-capitalist. It's about a man siphoning money to line his pockets instead of caring for, helpless animals. So, I also read the Simulacra, I don't know if I'm saying that right, by Philip K. Dick. And this is about, like, just so many things. Like, if you've ever read Philip K. Dick, you know that, like, this is a mind trip. But all this stuff kind of, like, works to create this world. And I think that's what I was reading it for, was I didn't care too much about the plot. I really honestly didn't care too much about the characters. I cared about the world building and how this world was created. So it's about, like, the fakeness of politics, making people feel like they have a choice or a role in politics, but really they're just being controlled by unseeable forces and corporations. It was very eerily similar to our current political times, especially with this group called the Sons of Job, which really kind of gave me, like, Proud Boy vibes at first, and after. Yeah. But there's also, like, telekinetic musicians, laws against psychology, people giving birth to Neanderthals, and a man who believes he has highly offensive and contagious body odor. Very interesting story. I enjoy spending time in Philip K. Dick's, like, really weird little brain. Big brain. I don't think brain size matters when it comes to intelligence. Anyways, in his brain, but I'm also kind of relieved when I get to leave at the same time. It's like, okay, I need a break from all that really weird stuff. I listened to A History of Russia from Peter the Great to Gorbachev by Mark Steinberg. And this was a Great Courses audio book, so it was more like lectures than someone reading a book. It was really interesting because I got to see where Steinberg's interests lay instead of just it being, a straightforward history. I wish he had been more clear in the title, maybe, what he was going to concentrate on. But there were some interesting things. He presented this idea of, like, Russian attitudes, especially of the Tsars, and I can't remember the words correctly, so I'm going to try and pronounce them. So he presented the Tsars as having 2 main characteristics, and they'd have to embody both to be successful, and that was Testaishe, which was being gentle and religious and loving, but also Grovne, I believe was the other one, which is strong, powerful, being a hard ruler, being interested in the military, and they had to really kind of balance both of those. I wish he had extrapolated that to talk about the Russian people themselves, because that's what I'm more interested in instead of just the Tsars. And he spent almost as much time talking about the lead up to the Russian Revolution as he did talking about all the Tsars and everything that came before it. And my interest was more in pre-revolution Russia than post or leading up to the revolution in Russia, but it was still interesting. Then I read 3 volumes of Amulet by Kazu Kibushi. And this is about a young girl and her family who get transported to this other world, which is populated by robots and anthropomorphized animals. And they're thrown into a war between most of the population and these elves, who are the cruel leaders. There's one who in particular who's cruel. It was a really interesting mixture of like technology and magic, and I really, really liked the art and how full color and glossy the pages were, and how it was a mixture of like dark colors, but then you also have like this pink fluffy bunny that's following her around. I was like, I kind of like this. And it deals with some pretty heavy topics too. Like, yes, it's your traditional fantasy type story, but it deals with things like grief and poverty and like toxic family relations and stuff like that. My religious book for this month was The Strange Silence of the Bible in the Church by James D. Smart, and I get most of my physical books from thrift stores, so I end up reading a lot of older theological texts, and that's what this one is. It's from the 1970s, but it's still, I feel like it's still relevant, and that's kind of scary, because the things that he's talking about should have been changed. So he talks about the complications of interpreting the Bible, giving the boom in research at the time, especially the historical context, the biases of the original writers, then the biases of the translators, and the biases of the people interpreting it, and then ourselves, our own biases that we bring to it, and of not leaning one way or the other towards just historical context or just theological meaning or taking the Bible literally. He talks about the failure of churches and pastors who learn all this stuff in seminary, and they fail to pass this on to the laity, they're people who attend church, or completely kind of ignoring it altogether, especially in cases where pastors don't really go to seminary. That's a whole other issue I could talk about, but let's not talk about it. And this kind of results in kind of the fundamentalism that we see today. The only drawback was that he points out all these problems, but he doesn't really point out solutions. Like, you can't all of a sudden just change the way things are, and how you preach, because then you might lose a bunch of members from the church, right? So you have to go about it in a certain way. Then I read Beloved by Toni Morrison, and I actually think the less I say about the plot about this, the better. I think it's best to go in not knowing anything and just letting the story unfold for you. So very basically, it's about Setha. I looked that up, it's Setha, a runaway slave, and dealing with the effects of slavery. So this is a book where you have to pay attention actually while you're reading it, because it drops major themes and plot points in little ways. I had this kind of sneaking suspicion all the way through this about different things and that were happening, and I had to wait until the near the end of the book to get confirmation or not. And you'll know what I'm talking about if you've read it there. I like it because it makes you part of the story as well. As in, it takes you in and it involves you in the story, as it doesn't say anything, it doesn't always say it straight out. You have to pay attention. I also read They Called Me Number One by Bev Sellers, and this is a nonfiction about a woman's time at residential school and the lasting effects it had on her life. So she says herself that her experience is not as horrible as other people's, which involved, sexual abuse, brutal beatings, running away from school, sometimes even death. But her treatment was still unacceptable, and her pain is still valid. She was still, physically, emotionally, mentally, medically abused. And this really shows the overarching effect residential schools had on children, and how that effect carried on into adulthood. Like accepting the fact that people in authority are going to hurt you. Think now about police violence, especially in Canada towards the Indigenous population. Or that white people are superior to Indigenous people in every way solely based on their skin color. The lack of education also played a large effect. She at one point pointed out that she was never told that she'd have to go into the more academic stream instead of the more technical applied stream to become a nurse. And that lack of education carried on, of course, into her income. And her own education. This is definitely a book I'd recommend if you're looking to learn more about the residential school problem in Canada and its lasting effects, and it's definitely a great introduction into the issue. Then I also read The Satellite People by Hans Olaf Lahlum. And this is actually the second book in the K2 detective series. It's set in 1960s Norway, and the murders actually have to do with World War II, and particularly the resistance movement in Norway. And that's for both book 1 and book 2. Book 1 is called The Human Flies, by the way. Each book also kind of presents this idea. So for example, in the first one was the idea of human flies. And human flies are people who just spend their lives, swirling around this traumatic event that happened in their lives. In this one, we have satellite people who are drawn to someone regardless of how badly that person treats them. And their lives kind of just circle around that person. So we follow the murder of a wealthy businessman who seemed like a really horrible person right from the get-go to me. Yeah, and the satellite people that are following him that are all suspects in the murder. It was slightly annoying that he writes out everyone's full name when referring to them, even if it's in the same paragraph. Like first name, middle name, last name, every time. And it was just, it got a little annoying. And I said, can't you just refer to them by one name? Just pick one name and stick with it instead of writing out their full name every time you talk about them. Then I did another reread of a favorite children's chapters book of mine, and that was The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle by Avi, which is about a 13-year-old girl in the 1830s sailing from England to America, and her journey does not go as expected. So she's warned right from the very beginning not to get on this ship. She's going to be alone on this ship with a bunch of men. She's armed by both the crew and the captain, and because it's middle grade historical fiction set on a ship written in the 1990s, there's going to be a mutiny. Reading it as an adult, I was very concerned for this 13-year-old girl being the only female on board a ship full of sailors and a captain with a bad reputation. And she kept saying, oh, my upbringing has, and everything in my education has taught me to just obey and acquiesce to those who are older than me. And it thankfully didn't go there because it's a middle grade book. But yeah, it was still there in the back of my mind every time I was reading it. It actually had some great themes, like questioning gender roles and gender appearances, because she at one point has to dress like a sailor and cuts off her hair. And in the 1830s, as a rich white woman, that was like, oh boy, you don't do that. It also talked about socioeconomic class and how that shouldn't be equated with morality. And it had your typical 90s middle grade themes like run away from oppressive family dynamics and go be a sailor. This seems like something that happened quite a lot in 90s middle grade books. The last thing I read was Points of Origin by many different authors. It was an anthology. It was a collection of short stories taking place in the Stargate universe. So Stargate SG-1 and Stargate Atlantis. Thankfully it didn't go into Stargate Universe. We don't talk about Stargate Universe anyways. And I thought they'd all be origin stories because that's kind of what the back read like. And like the first story was an origin story. But they weren't all origin stories. And they weren't necessarily like origin stories in the sense of like this is how I came to be part of the team. One of them, the one about Ronan, was kind of him on his home planet before he met the Stargate Atlantis crew, and the origin of how he got his really fancy gun. There were different characters, and there were some already established characters and some new characters. It was really interesting. I loved it. I can't complain about any of it because I just love Stargate so much that you could give me a bad book about it, and I have read a bad book about it, but I still enjoy it because it's like watching an episode in your head. It's just like, oh, if it's a bad episode, there could be another episode. Overall, the whole series is great. The whole universe is great. I love it. Anyways, yes. And just another update. No, I still have not finished Brothers Karamazov. That is not going at all right now. But I want to. But it didn't happen in November. So that's it. That's what I read in November. Let me know if you've read any of these, what you thought of them. And what was your favorite book that you read in November? Thank you for watching.